everyone. Welcome to another week of ProMAX Tech Talks. I have Mike, Taylor, and Brian on the line, and this week we're going to be talking about disaster recovery and what to do in case anything happens at your office where everything just goes down. So, Brian, let's get started with you. Why do companies need a disaster recovery plan in the first place?
If you're dealing with anybody else's data or data that keeps your company moving, if you're producing something for video or anything, the data is your commodity. Like that's like having locks in your doors of your warehouse, right? Like you've got to protect what's yours. And disaster recovery is kind of the overarching umbrella of protecting that stuff, be it from a single drive failure to an entire chassis failure to your data center getting flooded. Like there's a lot of different levels of it and a lot of different ways to mitigate it and to defend against it. And it all comes down to your tolerances, your budgets, and things like that. But there's a lot of things to consider in it.
Okay, so what types of disaster recovery plans are there? Like, is there a set, like, here's what everyone should be doing, or does it change based on the technology you're using, what kind of industry you're in? Can you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, so obviously I'm going to kind of focus a little bit on the video production, film production side. And usually, when we talk about disaster recovery, we're looking beyond typical backup and archive type operations. This is the abnormal. This is not the normal situation. So you're potentially, again, you're talking about like if entire systems go down or entire facilities go down, what are you going to end up doing? And usually disaster recovery is predicated on utilizing your backups, and offsite backups are usually the big factor there. You look at facilities like Iron Mountain. Services like Iron Mountain is a big one that a lot of people use to offsite data backups and documents and things like that. And now that we've got cloud connectivity and stuff, a lot of that's become a lot easier for some of the more sensitive, smaller items. But we're a little unique in the video world where we're dealing with gigabytes and terabytes are not uncommon. So cloud doesn't always do everything we need it to do. So it's still not quite that easy. But yeah, there's a ton of different ways to go about it. The biggest and most common, like I said, is the offsite backup. Is just getting data in a different place on a different system or in a different medium somewhere that is not going to suffer the same fate as whatever your primary data center might have just gone through. So that's usually the first step and the first consideration.
Okay, Mike, you're first person to get hit when someone calls in with any kind of support issue. So obviously disaster recovery would fall into that. What are some common things that you see lead to a situation where someone's needing disaster recovery?
There's certain situations where like there's a power outage and server won't turn on, versus like a RAID controller goes out where your data you can't access it. So in a sense, there's certain ways to prepare for things like that. Certain times where you can have like battery backups in case your server, protect from your server going down at times. So you may have a battery backup keep the server going essentially. However, if the server won't turn on at times, that you might be able to get a replacement power supply, or maybe like there's a faulty part. So if you have a RAID controller that does go bad, maybe you'll have one on the shelf like ready to swap in. Just having that ability and spare parts available will help in certain times to be prepared ahead of time. So.
Okay, now here's another question on that to go along with that. How many people are actually prepared for this? Does it seem like everyone seems to have a backup plan for that, or do you see a lot of times where people aren't prepared for something like this?
There's quite a bit where they're not quite prepared for it. If a RAID controller goes bad, they need to have another one, but if they don't have one on hand, they'll either need to buy one or have it RMA'd, and it's not the quickest thing to get another one if we don't have one in stock or if we can't get one. So it's always good to make sure to buy a second one to have one on shelf spare just in case, or even like an extra power supply for redundancy. So if you have one, you can swap that right in and just be right back up and running. So.
Okay. So Taylor, to elaborate on that a little bit, like if you were to recommend a emergency kit of parts for someone to have sitting around for something like this, what would you want to have in that?
drives, power supply, RAID controller, maybe even a spare stick of RAM or two. But besides that, there's not too much you should need that you would be swapping like on the fly.
Okay. Now, after someone goes and builds out a disaster recovery plan, or say they already have one in place, how do they go about testing that plan to make sure it's actually going to work when something goes down? Brian, could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about getting the buy-in from your I guess your facility management, your management, to really put something through its paces, because a lot of this stuff is difficult to truly see realized unless a lot of moving parts come into play. Because usually, especially when you get into a more facility wide or server room wide kind of disaster recovery plan, there's a ton of moving parts. Like, you've got to be able to cut a lot of people over to different things in a short order and make sure that they can work, make sure that they can continue moving. And depending on how large your organization is and what your resources are, that could be several hours worth of work depending on the scale of things. So just getting the buy-in, making sure everyone's aware. Sometimes it's difficult to get management to truly acknowledge something that's for preparedness as opposed to general productivity. Like shutting things down for a couple hours to test a failover situation is never an easy thing to get scheduled. It can be done after hours, things like that too, with a limited amount of stuff. But really, the only way to know if it's going to work for everybody and to make sure that everybody's comfortable with it, if it does go down, is to do it during normal operation and kind of run a fire drill and make sure that it works. Big companies do that kind of stuff for a reason. They have policy around, a lot of times they test that stuff once, twice a year in some cases. It's going to vary depending on, again, the tolerances that you have. Like if it's a 99.9 99's uptime kind of thing, then it's something IT is literally there for every day. If it's something, a video production firm, something like that, where you've got some failover servers and stuff that you know about but have never used, now it might be time to start playing around with it and kind of set a time and a schedule and actually do a day to pull the plug and see what happens and make it work, get used to it and get some documentation on paper.
Okay. And then, so say you run that test and your plan fails. Like what would be your next step?
Well, I mean, like anything, you're still going to learn something from a failure. You're probably going to learn more from a failure than a success. Quite honestly, just because everything was successful doesn't necessarily mean that it was as efficient as it could have been, or any number of things. So if you fail, dissect it, do the postmortem, see what worked and what didn't, and be realistic too. Again, I keep talking about the tolerances. If you have specific tolerances for your industry, your business, your work, you have to be prepared to spend the money to hit those tolerances. So if you don't have the right equipment to maintain, what you need in a failover plan, you have to be realistic about it. It's easy to skimp on this stuff because it's not something that is happening every day, and a lot of that equipment is stuff that will save you, in that one day, somewhere months from now or years from now, or hopefully never. It's an insurance policy, right? Nobody wants to cash in on the insurance policy, but man, when you pay for it, it hurts. And if you have the option not to pay for it, people tend to lean in that direction. So just if it fails, just keep an eye on what it was that failed and work to resolve that, and try it again.
All right, now let's take it one step further. Now let's say this happened, your plan fails, but this time it's the real deal. Like, this isn't a fire drill. Oh shit, everything's gone. What would that look like?
So if you have an actual disaster situation, you lose an entire raid group, or you lose an entire facility and have to rebuild. We've actually had clients that have had fires in server rooms and things like that. And ironically, it's not the fire that gets everything. It's the sprinkler system that just takes out. Once a fire kicks in, sprinkler system goes off in your server room, and you can pretty much bet you're replacing just about everything in there. So When things like that happen, you know, you have a lot of moving parts to deal with. You've got the insurance about getting the actual things replaced, but from a data perspective, you might be recalling stuff, LTO tapes from Iron Mountain. You might be, you know, your producer might take a hard drive home every weekend or something that he's now got to bring in and plug in. That's a pretty common scenario, actually, just to get stuff off site. It comes down to, you know, executing your plan, making sure that, you know, the data that you had backed up somewhere is starting to come back if it was outside the room. Chances are you probably don't offsite every single thing, and you did lose some actual working data. But hopefully you've identified your tolerances and your backups account for that. And if you can survive a day's worth of missing data or a week's worth of missing data, then you're backed up to that point. Yeah, again, identify the tolerances and work to them and build that out. And then knock on wood, when it comes time to execute, you know, you're up to that point, and you can pull out the data up to the point that'll keep you alive as a company.
Okay, cool. So to wrap this topic up, I know earlier we talked about like what would be an emergency kit for disaster recovery. What about like what would be a checklist? Like if you had to give someone here, they're building a disaster recovery plan. Here's the 3 to 5 things that you need to make sure you have included in that. What would that look like, guys?
It's pretty much what Taylor said earlier. Hard drive, RAM, RAID controller, power supply.
Well, outside of
hardware?
outside of technology too. Like it could be like make sure you have this documented, stuff like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, you got to have a plan. You got to have it in more than just your head, and other people have to know the plan. Be it you know, if you're a small organization, you know, your editors need to know the plan. If you're a big organization, then everybody's got to know the plan. Excuse me. And you've got to have the other thing as well as the documentation on the devices and stuff. Like, boy, you want to talk about a nightmare, try replacing a bunch of computer hardware that you don't know what was even in it. You know, a lot of clients, you know, have stuff in their server rooms that they have had there for years and they don't really have any documentation on anymore. They don't know where the PO was that ordered it, stuff like that. You have to replace that kind of stuff or get equivalency for that kind of stuff from an insurance claim. And without documentation, that gets really complex very, very quickly. And in some cases, it can cost you good money where you can't necessarily replace the stuff that you need to stay going after a while. So document your plan, document your hardware and your contents of everything, and then you know, have the data plan in place. So if you have data you absolutely cannot live without, you got to have it in more than one place. You know, we've said it before. I've said it before in these. You know, we kind of work off the mantra, the one is none and two is one. You've got to have stuff in at least 2 places in 2 different file systems. And that's just mostly in a backup situation. Like if you want to take it to disaster recovery levels, you're probably talking about having, you know, at least 3 copies of stuff. You've got your primary, your backup, and an offsite. So you've got to have you've got to have your plan. You've got to have the hardware documented. Your plan documented, hardware documented. You've got to have the data actually offsite in place, protected. And then you've got to actually have a plan to recover that data and get it back into the hands of the people that can use it, which can sometimes be as hard as actually getting it off in the first place. So yeah, those are really the big 4. Yeah, those would be the big ones.
All right, cool. Thanks, guys. Mike and Taylor, do you have anything to add to that, or did Brian sum that up pretty well?
Covered all the bases.
All right, cool. Well, thanks, guys, for joining us for another week of ProMAX Tech Talks. I'm Matt, and this is our tech team. We'll see you next week. Follow our social channels if you haven't yet, and hit that red subscribe button to get more notifications when we leave some more of our video production tips on our YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.